it is time once again for the letter of the day. And today's letter is the letter C.
Cookie! Rover, this is the letter A.
This? Oh, that was my next guess.
Be good.
Yes.
Hello my friends, welcome back to the channel. Okay, this is gonna be a big one, so I'm not gonna waste much time here. I've wanted to make this documentary since probably before I even had a channel, having grown up in the 80s watching such amazing movies. But now that I'm a nerd and into UAP and all that sort of stuff, I can't help noticing an incredible amount of crossovers. So that led me to begin to investigate, is this all happenstance and coincidence? Are the people making the movies inspired by real events? Or is it something a little bit weirder? Well, I'll let you in on a secret. It's something a hell of a lot weirder. So, I'm breaking this down into 3 sections. Just like any good criminal investigation, we are going to investigate the method, the means, and the motive. Okay? So, in the method, I'm going to show you examples of classic movies that we've all seen, and one recurring theme that we'll notice later, just to show you that it's a thing. In part 2, which is later in this, I've got an interview with my very good friend and an expert on the field, author and screenwriter Mark A. Pritchard, who is a long-time friend of the channel from the UAP files. He's also got an interest in neuroscience, so if anybody could tell you about the effects on a brain of watching a good movie, it's him. In the 3rd section, we get to the motive, and that is where things get gritty. I have got evidence of the claims that we make in the first 2 parts of the video, so stick around to the end. I will put timestamps so that you can digest this in blocks. But for now, let me show you what I'm talking about.
To disconnect me.
Okay, so the first example from 1968 is 2001: A Space Odyssey. I wish I could show you clips, but the copyright police will pull me over. Now, 2 interesting parts of trivia just to start. This movie was shown to NASA insiders, closed doors, prior to its release, and apparently went on to really inspire their philosophy when it comes to exploring the stars, and their whole mission statement was framed around this. Secondly, Stanley Kubrick said that Steven Spielberg, which is going to be a recurring theme, was a massive influence at the formative part of putting the script together and the overall direction. So what about the plot? Well, key parts of it, the monolith itself, acts in exactly the same way, I believe, as UAP. It is a technological catalyst for the evolution of consciousness, which, when you look at incredible researchers like Grant Cameron and his theory of wow, is exactly what UAP does. It comes down, it freaks you out, and it makes you blow up your worldview, which causes the evolution of consciousness. It also touches on ideas of interdimensionality, the interconnectedness of consciousness and the human spirit. It's all very heady stuff when you consider this was from 1968. There's some very deep symbolism which is still relevant to the most cutting-edge conversations of the day. So, what's next?
no talk. Me, human. Boy. Elliot. 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 Be good. Be good. Oh, God!
Elliot.
What?
Elliot. Elliot.
I taught him how to talk now. He can talk now.
Alright, so the next example from 1981, E.T. the Extraterrestrial, directed by Steven Spielberg. So, this is from 1981. Okay, the movie opens with a stranded alien running through a wood into a suburban area where it bumps into some kids. The alien is brown, kind of slimy, weird looking, short, with a pot belly and gangly limbs. So let's wind it forward to the Varginha encounter from Brazil in the late 90s, where 3 children bump into a stranded alien following a crash, and it's brown, wrinkly. Apparently there was a really bad smell, but that's not an ET. It's kind of slimy looking. And honestly, from the drawing that the children who witnessed it did, if you change its eye colour from red to blue, which you can imagine being an obvious cinematic choice, I mean, it's going to be harder to bond with something with glowing red eyes. It's the same looking thing. So either that's weirdly prophetic, and the question to ask yourself is why, if you're designing a cute little alien that you want people to like, why would you pick those physical characteristics? Was there an insider report of this being a particular type of entity which shows up in UAP encounters? Could be a coincidence? Well, let's move on. We'll skip over the fact that children witnesses are acting as the point of contact, as seen by things like the aerial school in Zimbabwe and the 4,500 child eyewitnesses that I've covered in my school's report. So what's next?
There is something down there. Something not us. Not human. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. We all see what we want to see. He sees hate and fear. You have to look with better eyes than that.
(1989), The Abyss, directed by James Cameron. So, this is a US Navy interaction with a non-hostile, deep-sea, non-human intelligence. It aligns with counts of USOs like the Nimitz encounter and all of the things, you know, Ryan Graves, the Tic Tac, the immense amount of UFO encounters that we've got through history. It deals with Navy patents for underwater propulsion systems. Commander Fravor was talking about transmedium craft. This features brightly lit craft which can go from water into the air with no problem at all. And there is also an extremely strong theme at the end, particularly of the extended edition, where they are about to wipe humanity out for their disrespect to the planet. And it shows all the cruel atomic bombs and all of that sort of stuff and how they're destroying the environment. Again, if you go forwards to the aerial school encounter, which was a long time after The Abyss, the school children that met these alien beings were told telepathically, you're not looking after your planet. If it dies, then you die. It's as simple as that. So again, is this strangely prophetic of a future encounter? Or is this a repeat theme which has been seeded through media to be slightly more acceptable, a slightly less catastrophic form of disclosure? Well, let's move on.
Monsieur Neary, êtes-vous un artiste, un peintre?
Mr. Neary, are you an artist or a painter? No.
Brûlure sur le visage et sur le corps?
You're burning on your face and on your body?
Yes. Who are you people?
Unit 211, 1030, 57.
Monsieur Neary, êtes-vous...
Okay, so this one's obviously on the nose. Close Encounters of the Third Kind from 1977, directed by Steven Spielberg. Where to even start? So this has got a cameo from J. Allen Hynek at the point where they meet the mothership. He was the head of Operation Blue Book, and that's not where his involvement ends. He was also a consultant to writing the script. The plot retells perfectly, probably the most concretely accepted case in history, which is the Holloman Air Force Base landing, which is this footage here. It's got Jacques Vallée in it as the point of contact, the French scientist who manages to work out communication. Let's get to the plot points. It's got radiation damage, where Richard Dreyfuss gets sunburn. It's got disrupting electrical and vehicle equipment. It's got smaller scout craft that are sort of all these mad lights. And then it's got this giant mothership at the end. It's got psychic compulsion, which was a massive part of the film and something which really wasn't talked about until now and is experienced by people that come into contact with UAP. Their old world dies and becomes irrelevant to them, and they are massively compelled to explore and investigate this new thing that they've made contact with. It's a central point of the movie. It also covers the whole government cover-up. There are crates unloaded with Lockheed Martin written on it. What, you know, like, what else has it got to do? This also echoes accounts from the 1973 Pascagoula UAP encounter, which, again, is just worth a Google. But I'm not going to stop there. Let's move on. Okay, 2016, you had Arrival, which is a fantastic film. Some of the central features in that which separate this from the usual kind of alien movie: language as a form of contact, that hard barrier between species and cultures, and telepathic downloads that experiences have had, all during CE5 practices. The idea of non-linear time, which is something outside of human understanding, but these intelligences can see the entire breadth of a human experience and arguably manipulate it. It also deals with the framing of how contact with the phenomenon can completely change your ontological view and your entire understanding of reality, which is a central tenet in most people's interactions with it. So, what's next? Favorite, Flight of the Navigator. I love this movie. This came out when I was 5, and I loved it as a kid. And now that I'm investigating UAP, trying to do it full time, all roads lead back to that. So, yeah, if you've not seen it, it is phenomenally concurrent with the most cutting-edge discussion on UAP. There is a interdimensional time-traveling craft with its own consciousness that communicates telepathically with a child. It doesn't care about politicians or social structures or the military or NASA. It has a it crashes, essentially. It runs into a power line and crashes, which is what happens during the Trinity crash that Jacques Vallée has written books about. It uses the child as its pilot, as its navigator. When you study accounts studied by Preston Dennett and Grant Cameron of conscious contactees, people who have been on the ship, either consciously or physically, they describe the same thing. They sit in this chair, they put their hands on a nondescript console, there's no joysticks or anything, and then your mind deals with the actual control of the craft. It does all of the 5 observables: instantaneous acceleration, immediate changes of direction. It's transmedium, it goes under the water. It talks about preserving life and traveling across the galaxy as this kind of almost like a Van Neumann probe, which we're going to get to in other discussions. It is outside of time, and yet it directly warns the kid in the movie, like, you humans cannot do this. This is very, very dangerous for you to do. And it deals with, the manipulation of time, which echoes all of these prominent people in ufology right now. 9 out of 10 of them all say, well, this weird thing happened when I was a kid. And it's like, well, okay, why? What are the chances of something happening when you were a kid and then going on to be prominent in the field? Gary Nolan, Jim Semivan, to name but a few. So I was discussing this with my friend Mark Pritchard and just how profound it is. And he said, well, why don't you just get in touch with the guy that wrote it and ask him directly? So I did. Now, I didn't get his permission to read this out, so I'm going to paraphrase a hell of a lot. But he told me that the actual script of Flight of the Navigator was by no means a first draft. In fact, the first draft of the movie was going to be that this kid had the idea, like a blueprint, in his head. NASA then get him and do brain scans, and it's very detailed information, and they build the craft based on the plans. And then at the end of the movie, the kid gets in it and scoots off. There's none of the high strangeness correlation that is actually in the second script. So I asked, did you have any help from, say, the Pentagon? And he said, well, funnily enough, yes, I did. I had an advisor who initially was telling him about the legality of whether someone like NASA could essentially kidnap a kid, which happens in the movie. And they said, yes, that's a fully legal thing. But he also gave him prompts and tidbits to drop into the script. And when you consider the unbelievable profundity of the final project, then it's crazy to think that this information has not been seeded. I mean, he directly said he had a Pentagon advisor giving him tips for the script. Also, just as a trivia point, this is getting a completely unnecessary remake rather than writing a sequel to it, which would have been much better. But that's me talking rather than being relevant to the documentary. So what's next? All right, so we've probably accepted that that's a hell of a lot of coincidences. So what's the method of soft disclosure via media? Would it be a viable way to essentially reprogram somebody's psyche? Well, I can give you an example of that. Yes, I, growing up, was fascinated by the first generation of Transformers cartoons, where we were introduced to Optimus Prime, the noble and humble leader. And I absorbed, first of all, my vocabulary was massively improved. We were hearing about the maniacal Megatron, and it just stuck. But secondly, the mannerisms of Optimus Prime as a leader. He's the ultimate kind of father figure, and his compassion, his dignity, his respect for the other Autobots. It all sounds so silly, but he was the perfect role model to kids growing up in the 80s, and like a sci-fi surrogate father, if you will. So I asked an expert. I happen to be very good friends with Mark A. Pritchard, who is a successful author and screenwriter with a very healthy interest in neuroscience. In fact, one of his jobs was to teach people under stress to remember safety guidelines and protocols that would protect their health and keep them alive. So there is nobody better to ask when it comes to this. So here's an interview that I did with Mark, and then we're going to get to some real scandalous stuff. Right, my very good friend, Mark, Mr. Pritchard. How are you?
Very well, thanks, Tom. Good to see you, mate.
Excellent. And you, always. So I am in a phenomenally lucky position that this topic that I'm investigating at the moment of UAP and its involvement with Hollywood is something that you're particularly well read on, being a successful screenwriter, author, and an interest in neuroscience. So I'm blessed to have you on this call, mate.
No, pleasure. Let's get at it and see what we can pick apart.
Absolutely. So, I mean, you know, we've already talked a bit about the gist of this. Is I am fascinated by the correlations as I look into ufology. After growing up a fan of sci-fi and all of those brilliant movies from the 80s, 90s and onwards, then we get into actually studying it as a real thing. And then you go, oh my, the amount of times we go, oh my God, that's that thing from Batteries Not Included in the 80s. Or we rewatch Flight of the Navigator and they're talking about interdimensional transmedium consciousness motivated craft. It becomes a little bit too much of a 300-pound saucer in the room, if you like, to not address it. So, what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, we've been nattering behind the scenes since I became addicted to you and Jimmy on the UAP files. It's the most fascinating topic of our time, I think. And hopefully, as things uncover and unfurl, we'll have much more to talk about over the next few years. But I got into narrative all the way back through my degree. My degree is in drama. But during the sort of 25 years I was working in proper jobs, let's say, before I gave up my soul to the film gods, I was doing things like behavioral change in the energy industry. And we started to notice... so if you picture yourself offshore on a rig in, say, the Mediterranean, right? So you're offshore from, say, Egypt. It's an affectionate term, but we call them tool pushers, the engineers who work the rig. The tool pushers, their first language is Arabic, and they all speak immaculate English or Italian to speak to their American English or Italian boss. So there's that immediate strain that once you're on a kind of contained environment, there's a lot of pressure, there's a lot of risk. Things can go badly wrong if procedures aren't followed. And from time to time, this would happen. So we would look into it when there were incidents, and I would get involved from a behavioral change point of view. And I would go on to the rigs, and you would find your tool pushers, engineers who are responsible for sending information up the line to the drilling director, sometimes a bit scared of the boss who'd been yelling at them in their second language. And it's like, oh, what's happened to the human in that place? Well, sympathetic stress response is pretty high, right? Because in those circumstances, often you have many generations of one family relying on one salary, right? So the pressure is on them not to lose that job ever. So the implied thing is never say no to the boss, but that's very bad in terms of information. So how do we stop that sympathetic stress response triggering the limbic part of the brain, which shuts down your ability to recall written information? Because what these companies love to do is give a health and safety or a procedural list or a toolbox checklist, toolbox talk thing where they go through a checklist, right? And then the company's done their duty because the information's there and should be recoverable under any circumstances. But that's not how human systems work. So we found that we could get story to hit in a different way. So on one occasion, we were worried about a pattern of increasing potential near fatal accidents. And if you don't do something to intervene in those circumstances, you're going to lose someone. And even in the most fierce industries, they really work hard to protect humans, which is one of the good things about those industries. It's why they had slightly strange folk like me involved. So we did this thing where they flew me around the world to 4 sites on different continents, interviewing people, and we started to put together person-to-person stories. So imagine one tool pusher to another, saying about not the kind of technical merits of the accident, but the impact, the story of it happening, how it affected their family. Some of these, I won't describe the injuries, but they're significant, right? They'll stop you working, and could have been far worse. What we were trying to trigger there is what the psychologist Melanie Green coined as narrative transport. So narrative transport, I have a way I explain it that kind of involves a lot of the science. If you imagine your parents reading you The Hobbit, all right? So you are taken from your bedroom to the Shire, and there's that sense of immersion, right? It's vivid. You care about the characters involved in it. You're interested to see what happens next. You're there rather than here. You have been transported by the narrative. That's sort of immersive sensation that I think we've all experienced from time to time. It's very, very powerful with humans. My thesis was that it could break through the sympathetic stress response and get people to remember things. And sure enough, that particular event, we shut down rigs on one day all the way around the world as the timeline went around, played the film of the stories, and then had the engineers talk to each other, exchanging stories. So it's a big kind of story event, and it worked. We got a huge reduction in the number of near-fatal accidents, and that was great. But it left me very curious about what is going on with story. And there's actually a lot of decent research. Steve Pinker talks about the evolutionary impact of story. And you can imagine if we're all cave dwellers, right? Just being told to do something wouldn't work, but being told about a way to deal, a story around hunting or predation, not being predated, or seasonal change, moving your tribe, would then, if they trigger that immersive sense, then when they see the circumstances, they're like it's like they've already been there, and they can recall the information. It remains available even when they're stressed.
That's really interesting. I'm just going to interrupt you because
no, please, yeah.
I feel like you're underselling it, because I've read your scientific paper proposal, which identifies that written instruction. It was like the most obvious slap in the face, but we've only been using writing for a few hundred years, whereas we've been acting out in story. If you look at indigenous tribes and things like the haka, story and action and kinetics is a much better way to ingrain sort of information into people. But that core part where written information is incredibly hard to recall under stress, I think that's key. Obviously, I mean, we've all been in that situation where you're in a bad job, and then the harder the stress gets, the less your ability to do that job, and then you reach a breaking point of recalling how to do it. So it's really, really valuable that you've locked in on this essence of kind of play, or acting it out. But how that bypasses the stress reaction is fascinating to me.
Yeah, and sadly I couldn't get funding for that PhD proposal, but I think I think the idea is solid. That if you think about, I mean, there's all sorts of interesting talks about how long humans have been here, but it's a fact that we haven't had generally available to the mass populace written information, for more than 200 years, right? From Gutenberg press to how, written information began to be socialized. So it's an absolute tip of the iceberg of our experience. So it's not surprising that, it's hard for the biological beast to respond to it. But story, my goodness, religious parables have been there for a reason, right? They're easy to recall. You can go back to the
Brothers Grimm and
whatnot. Brothers Grimm. Thank you. Yeah, the kind of cautionary tales. The reason why you don't mess around in the woods as a kid was because there's a lot of wolves there, right? Were a significant threat if you're a kid. And the story would be recalled, and they'd be able to do that under pressure. So like peer pressure from kids. Let's go further in the woods. No, that story. There's a reason we're not doing that. It will work. You can see it working. So as a story guy now, kind of more front and center for my work, it's trying to think how do you by means of craft get that sense of immersion? Because interestingly, with film, it's such a visual medium. It's different from getting a novel, which I have done in the past. Got one novel out, but I'm trying to find ways to make the characters matter to people actively with screenplays too, so that they're just that little bit more gripping rather than exposition fests. I mean, it's an interesting thing because this subject is so it's both truly complex, like complex in the real sense of the word, but also loaded, right? Everyone has an opinion, and people who have not got intellectually curious about it, let's be kind, right, are quite scathing about it. But I think actually it's story that is helping to change the tide with that.
Do you think that there's actually any evidence of Hollywood doing this in the past?
I mean, you hear the sense of nudges going on, don't you? With I mean, the famous one is particularly Spielberg and Close Encounters, and it's made more interesting by the sense that we think he may have had an experience himself.
Yes.
Are they using story deliberately with an understanding that it will percolate? I think that's an interesting. If they're not, they bloody should, because it's the way we're wired to respond best to the information. Forcing facts on people who are kind of fairly hardline on subjects will not make them believe it more.
No.
Story is an amazing way to nudge beliefs, to share experience, to soften the hard lines of thinking, and to give people context where sometimes they struggle to get it. So it would be a brilliant candidate, if it's used well, to affect significant change.
I'm sure that the empire
remove your faculties, right? It's just,
of course.
It's like it gives you a different set of lenses to understand the world with, and we're wired to receive it that way.
I'm sure that the empire that spent more money on counterintelligence and understanding psychology than any other in history has probably got the gist of that this might be a useful.
So that stuff's interesting, right? I'm always. I mean, the way the world is at the moment, I'm always kind of slack-jawed with amazement that rhetoric works as well as it does. When story can be so much more effective. I'm rather relieved they don't go to the efforts that is required. Because the thing with narrative transport is it's not a casual thing. If a story is done clumsily, it won't trigger it. And maybe that's why it's not their tool of choice, because the craft is not insignificant. Whereas rhetoric is a fairly lazy tool. Like I say, I'm just slightly speechless that it's as effective as it is.
Well, I mean, there's a great example of that, because you see somebody as qualified and authentic as David Grush testifying under oath in front of the world and Congress, and your average person on the street sort of goes, nah. But then they have that experience themselves, and even if they don't understand what happens or they just see something perfectly anomalous, that's it. It's that subjective kind of picking you up and shaking you on an individual level. It has to be experiential, and I think there's something about movies which are experiential. You're kind of in there and swept along with the like the qualitative, the emotional side, aren't you, rather than just the
100%
the plot as such. Yeah.
But interestingly, people like this new guy Matthew Brown are telling stories of their experience of seeing David Grush be bold and morally courageous on the subject, and it shifting their behaviour and giving them courage to act in a similar way. So there is a trigger there, because if any of us who are keen on this subject talk about that 2023, was it a select committee where Grush was testifying?
Yep.
We can all remember it vividly, because we were there with goosebumps going, did he just say that? Did he actually just say that there? Oh my God, right.
Yeah.
It's a line in the sand for those of us who are, well into the world.
Yeah, but it was almost like watching a legal drama. It was like watching a movie, wasn't it? That congressional hearing. It had all the beats. And it had our hero figures, and I think that was perhaps why, because I can certainly remember that one better than the last two hearings and stuff that came out, because there was more of that thread of this is what's gone on. I mean, there is evidence that what we can say 100% fact is that in the movie industry, and I don't want to speak over you being in that field, but I know there's a relationship with the CIA and the military where they will lend you helicopters and tanks and stuff like that, as long as
if your
they
name's
get
Bruckheimer, they will.
yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, exactly. I mean, how he blagged Top Gun on I think it was the Enterprise they were on. But anyway, so there's obviously some form of correction or editing or course steering when it comes to anything that mentions the CIA. Like that's a pretty well-known thing. It has to go through them first to be approved. So do you think that there's any kind of truth to it, that things that we've seen in movies may well be a dissemination of actual fact?
I'd love to think that someone was demonstrating that level of sophistication in their thinking. My experience of large bureaucracies, which is what we're talking about, is that good thinking struggles to make its way through them. So it may be that almost by accident that's happening, because the sender of information will like story as a means, all right? Because we're all human, and the receiver will like it. It may just be a natural side effect of people trying to do the right thing, and story finding its way through that way. I think the jury's out on whether the bureaucracies have an appetite for true disclosure.
Well, I mean, that's a question I'm definitely going to come on to, but I think when I remember these kind of Saturday night movies that I watched as a kid with the with the cynical adult head now, and you rewatch Indiana Jones, for example, and the last scene is a warehouse with Lockheed Martin stencils on the side. It's like that's a little on the nose. Or we've mentioned Flight of the Navigator, but there's just several times. Close Encounters is in many circles regarded a documentary as to the Holloman Air Force.
Right? Folk that know always nod to
the
that
Holloman
one.
Air Force Base landing, and
I think people have said nice things about Contact in the same way, right?
I believe so. I believe so. It's so hard to separate opinion from fact, but there's all of these movies where it's that p-value for this being coincidence. But the question is, there's obviously, we're slightly biased in wanting, well, I am, in wanting this to be accurate, but there's the issue of, has reality caught up with what somebody's been inspired by? Like, say, Gene Roddenberry, obviously, he was talking about mobile phones, computers, voice activated, this, that, and the other, teleportation and warp drive. And I don't think necessarily this was because this was all secret technology that they were trying to disseminate. I just think he saw an idea for the future, like a venture capitalist, if you like.
So hopeful. I love
the
sense absolutely. Of hope from that time.
Me too. If we're going to make it to the future, it's because we're the best we can be. I love that. Not because we've dominated our surroundings.
No.
So maybe there's a bit of narrative transfer in that. If you love this and you aspire to be like these people, it's because you're going to cooperate and, a little bit of optimism like that. But then you get the stuff like the new Top Gun, where Lockheed go, oh, here, the Dark Star's obsolete. You can have a play with it now, and that's its kind of debut to the world. I'm not saying that was an actual craft, but it's relatively obvious that there's been something that I could talk about this for hours, so I won't. But there are other things. Pardon? Oh, I know. That gets into the whole black triangles and all of that, sonic booms over the Atlantic, but.
I mean, it's shifting quite a bit, right? The sense of an experience like Close Encounters feels slightly further away to my mind, and the whole thing is skewing into consciousness and what equipment the human being has at their internal disposal in a quantum entanglement sense. I know that word gets very much overused, but there's obviously more going on there, and maybe it's things like your favourite Flight of the Navigator, not so much the physicality of the ship, but the time slipping and the sense of the way it deals with thought and space. Maybe that's going to be more on the money as time passes. It's
bonkers. It is, and when you hear, I mean, that one in particular. Obviously, I love that movie and have done since I was a child. But then, as I investigated ufology and then watched it, and then thanks to a conversation with you, managed to speak to the guy that wrote it. There's just, it can go through time. It can change shape. It can communicate telekinetically. The NASA guys and Lockheed guys that have got this craft can't access it without. And these are all stories that we're hearing people like James Lukatsky talking about. We had this thing sat in a hangar with a Brazilian military chief, so obviously Varginha, and then we couldn't access it until the right person. That's why people like Chris Bledsoe are grabbed by the great monster of government and brought into the mix, because they need these hippies to be the soft touch point with consciousness. You can't boss your way into working with this stuff.
When are we going to get a chat with Bledsoe?
Oh man, I know. Well, I've had a couple of messages back and forwards with him, and he's a lovely man, but he's also, I would imagine, one of the most sought after, busiest chaps out there.
I would say so. Yeah.
The next question then, mate, is to what end? I mean, something I really struggle with is you're either trying to keep a lid on this, as we seemingly are getting with the big media facing announcements, 1 minute for example, Trump's saying, "Yep, you're going to get all the files," and then nothing happens, and or these kind of it seems like the bigger the prospective announcement that we're going to get, the bigger the disappointment we then get. So if they're doing such a good job of hiding the penny on the mainstream, what motive do you think they would have to actually be dropping these bits of nuggets out?
I think everyone who goes on this journey, who gets to a certain point in the rabbit hole and realizes the Warren is considerably bigger than they thought it was, does experience that sense of ontological shock. And occasionally, that ain't comfortable, right? Particularly for experiencers who get near the sharp end of things. You know, some abductees have a rough time and a rough time reintegrating what they know into their lives with friends, family, loved ones. It's significant. You know, you sort of cross the Rubicon, and there is no unlearning this stuff. I have many friends who I would choose to not talk about this subject with because it would be uncomfortable for them. It would be uncomfortable for me. We can enjoy that bits of our friendship, which are a Venn diagram which cross over, right? But it's a shame in a way because there's some interesting stuff they might not find out about. That's to say, I think in the grand game, here's a what if. What if there is this gentle, uplifting pressure that there's a system that we need to plug into that humans are not currently evolving into correctly, right? Without getting political, you could argue that there's an awful lot of people for whom capitalism isn't working. There was an economist the other day who said a postmaster, right, it gets to the top of the tree as running a post office, should reasonably expect to send their kids to get educated, to own a house. And if you look at the salaries, that's not possible, right? So it's starting to crumble away at the bottom a bit. And maybe there's a way, if we get through this next journey and the ontological shock and the availability of using tech to run everything a little bit differently. Say energy isn't as expensive. Say maybe we need a little bit less of everything, and everything becomes a little bit simpler. If certain things become accessible to more people, I'm hoping that story might be the key through which that gets turned, in which ontological shock becomes survivable for people, because it's not comfortable for an awful lot of people, this subject. It shakes them religiously, it shakes them in all sorts of ways that they think the world is, that it isn't quite.
Yeah, that's perfectly said, man. I mean, I couldn't resonate with me more. I mean, I went from 20 odd years in the hospitality industry to a very fluffy experience with seeing UAP a few times, and it completely knocked the bottom out of my understanding of reality and my motivations to do my career and even the way I live my life. And there was definitely some dark nights to the soul. So I can't even imagine how people like Travis Walton, for example, have managed to navigate that in a pre-internet time when everybody that he spoke to would call him, you know, a liar, or actually attack him for challenging their ontological views. So I think there's a massive value to that. Do you think there's any? I mean, if I theorize, and obviously that's what I'm doing, I would speculate that if there's a higher order of complexity being out there, which seems to manifest in ways that we can predict but not understand, or at least recognize but not predict, perhaps. Then the idea of catastrophic disclosure, if you are trying to keep the curtain tight, like, you don't know if you're going to get to work in the morning and find out that some Independence Day sized mothership is you know what I mean, hovering over the White House.
Yeah.
And imagine, I've used this analogy so many times, but imagine if the Phoenix Lights happened in broad daylight. There would have been absolute chaos, because people would be seeing something that they'd never even conceived before. So I would suggest that there's possibly a little tempering of that
softening up.
Catastrophism by showing people Close Encounters of the Third Kind and all pretty lights and nice music and everybody's happy and safe, and E.T. and, you know, E.T. who looks identical to the Varginha entity but has blue eyes so that we don't get scared of his red eyes, and doesn't smell of rotten meat or whatever it was. So do you think there's
100%.
any...
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point. So I was born in 1973. I can't remember which year E.T. came out. Was it 83, something like that? And that's been an absolute pillar for me, alongside all the other movies, all the way through. And I'm sure it's piqued my curiosity. I was so obsessed as a kid in the 70s with the Apollo space program. Could name every bit of every module and every astronaut, and but the stories that really light you up are they're to do with aliens, to do with, you know, are they curious about us, as curious of us as we are of them, and obviously now we're older and I'm not sure wiser, but it's really a complex thing now. It's we get quite quickly into consciousness and multiverses, and I mean I'm convinced that things out there can bend space-time. And use it at their will. So there is the means to do that. Okay. So the discussion goes every time you think about it, right?
How can it not? Exactly like you said, we're ants in a rabbit warren.
Can we be trusted with those matchsticks? Right?
But, I mean, you just said, you just used the word multiverse.
Sure.
Now, I can sit in. I'm not going to be derogatory to anybody, but I can sit in some areas of humanity where people are not in any way interested in science or technology or anything like that, and they will be using words like quantum and multiverse and interdimensional because it's been in Marvel movies and stuff like that. So
yeah, that's true.
It's like we're kind of wrapping in a sweet wrapper extremely high concept ideas of reality and physics, and the question is, like, is that because somebody's read a scientific paper and gone, oh my god, that's cool, or is it because we're sort of trying to educate people in a field of play?
I think I'm lucky enough to live in Oxford in the UK, so I have science friends galore, and because the sort of peer-reviewed get your funding territory is quite so cutthroat and quite so boxed and quite so risk averse, there's a school of thought that our side, the kind of creative story side on, and from my world, is a safer sandbox in which to explore very serious ideas. The thing I've always loved about science fiction is that it gives you the most amazing mirror to do character studies, right? I'm interested in character-driven original stories, but science fiction allows you to look at that in a completely different light because you can skew the world, right, with a MacGuffin. Got to be a clever MacGuffin, but a MacGuffin will allow you to skew it. And, there's some brilliant authors like Ian M. Banks out there, God rest his soul, who would have whole books that read like historical novels, and then there'd be one MacGuffin towards the end of the book, and you'd realise that one of the people was an alien, and yeah, no, it was just fabulous.
Funny you mentioned that. I remember reading like the Wasp Factory and stuff when I was in school, and you make it a third of the way through the book, and then you go, "Oh my God, where are we going with this?"
Oh yeah. Well, that was in M Banks on the sci-fi side, right?
Oh well,
so he had the same name but put an M in for the sci-fi, and oh my God, I'm just thinking Accession. His book Accession was to do with sentient ships.
Okay.
Well played, Mr. Banks.
Yeah. Good day to buy a lottery ticket. But that's it, though. I mean, that's just another example of a hyper specific thing. And either these people should be spectacular venture capitalists, or it's stuff that is real. And I mean, the best stories are all things that you can imagine. That's why Alien is so good, because they're essentially truck drivers in space, and that could be in present day, and them working in a subway, and it would be just as good a story if that was some sort of crocodile or something, because it's the human interaction with the fear of the dark and unknown that you can identify with, which makes sci-fi such a great way to talk about current events in a sort of soft play setting, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But it fascinates me. So do you think this is going to continue? Do you think this is something relative to the less faith we have in authority, that we kind of have a bit more, we put our shield down when we're watching movies or something like that?
So the film game, as I've bemoaned to you many times, is in a interesting, tricky place where it's very difficult to get original films, even the like of which used to be studio films, the sort of $15 to $30 million bet is exceptionally hard to get made at the moment. So I'm not sure it's going to come and fill the void. What I do think, though, is it's folk like yourselves, the podcasters, who are going to continue to share story. And there's appetite for people to sit down and listen to good stories for 3 hours without stopping. Right, the human spirit for story has not vanished. It's shifting.
I think it's, as they say in a few circles, like twice is a coincidence, three's a pattern. And when you get to the absolute amount of stuff that's popped up in movies through the years, not all of it can be a lucky guess. I personally, I think I'm on that side of the camp. Yeah,
maybe the bureaucracies are better at this percolation of story than
yeah. Well, I mean, God, that's just another rabbit hole. But a lot of the remote viewers have come out and said sort of their school experience was very different, and they didn't realize it was different from other people's until they reached adulthood, and they were like, "What, you mean you didn't have extra lessons on meditation and stuff like this?" And what symbol am I thinking of and stuff like that. So it's God knows where the bottom of this looks.
Well, it didn't make it to my secondary comp, I can tell you that.
No, me neither. Mind you, I was in the country. I think they were picking their battles a little bit more than all the little farm boys in Cheshire where I grew up. Well, that's great, mate. Thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate it, Mark. As always, you're a great friend and a constant source of inspiration. So,
anytime I can help,
really
brother.
Lending me your expertise.
Please keep making the great stuff that you do. It matters. I appreciate it.
From you, that's a huge compliment. Thank you, mate. Okay, so we're into section 3, which is the motive, and this is where I found some real skeletons in closets. So let's start with the most obvious one. There is one name that you've heard over and over again throughout this documentary, Steven Spielberg. So I've had to write a list of this because my memory's terrible. You've got Close Encounter of the Third Kind from 1977, dealing with psychic contact and God knows, so much other stuff. E.T., 1982, empathy, contact with children, telepathy, government pursuit. Then he was on Twilight Zone, the movie, directed a segment from that. Then he directed AI, Artificial Intelligence, which deals with synthetic consciousness or a conscious machine. Sound familiar? Minority Report from 2002, which has precognitive visions and talks about the ethics of hidden knowledge. War of the Worlds, 2005. The idea of Project Bluebeam, collective trauma, soft disclosure. Super 8, he was a producer, 2011. Government cover-up, childhood witnesses, and again the threat narrative. Ready Player One from 2018 deals with alternate reality and hidden messages, with cultural mythology being key to a kind of evolving consciousness. I know that's a bit philosophical, but this is so on the nose. He's talking about disseminating information through pop culture. That's what the whole movie is about. Don't forget he was a consultant for 2001 from 1968. And he's got a movie coming out next year called Disclosure. What's going to be in that? So, okay, fine. He's this thing that keeps popping up. So what's his contact to Disclosure? Well, wouldn't it be weird if his older sister, Anne Spielberg, spent the early 70s working for, let me get this right, the US Air Force Office of Public Affairs, which dealt directly with counterintelligence and monitoring the public and public opinion. They have been used previously for War of the Worlds and The Day the Earth Stood Still to alter the script to change people's opinion of the red threat of communism and the Russians and the Russians. So there's a track record of manipulation of media by that exact government office. Now, if you want a really, really clear example of how the military can affect the media, which can affect your mindset and then change the overall reputation of the military, then I've got a great one for you. So it's fair to say in the late 70s, the US Navy and being a sailor in the Navy had a few connotations coming along with it that they probably didn't want to encourage at the time, and wasn't doing their recruitment into that armed force any favours. So when Tony Scott and Jerry Bruckheimer proposed the plot of Top Gun in the early 80s, they jumped at the chance. When they read the script and saw that it was about a handsome fighter pilot who gets all the girls and rides motorbikes with his cool buddies and flies the coolest fighter jet ever made, wins the war and is the ultimate patriot, they leapt at the chance. Not only that, but they lent the production crew the USS Enterprise aircraft carrier and the Jolly Rogers combat squadron of F-14s, which resulted in arguably the greatest recruitment video ever put to cinema, and certainly had a lifelong effect on all the little 5-year-old Toms and aviation nuts out there seeing a Tomcat in action for the first time. In the modern times, rather than movies as much, then they're going straight to influencers, YouTube and video games to get kids at their most formative stage. I'm not going to talk about the morality or humanity involved in this, but there are examples. There are YouTube videos all over the place sponsored by Go Army, Go Navy, the Air Force, where they're letting kids and influencers fly gunships, blow up tanks, and paint the armed forces in a fun, exciting light, as if it was the latest video game. The British Army even sponsored Fortnite to use as a recruitment tool. Nothing fills me with more dread than thinking that our armed forces are going to be full of Fortnite players. Two more examples of manipulation are Project Mockingbird and Project Dove. which were two classified operations to control journalism and the media. Now, these were brought to light in the 1976 Church Committee hearings, all of which is declassified, and I really encourage you to investigate. I need to check my notes a little bit because this isn't my area of expertise. But it showed that they had control, direct bribed control over 400 journalists, which is an enormous amount of the mainstream media in America at that time. And there are direct quotes from the Church report that says you don't buy off the journalists themselves, you buy off their bosses, and they handle the journalists. It's much harder to keep the reins on 400 people than their bosses, which have all got, say, 100 staff. That's 4 people. You know, I'm oversimplifying. But then you've only got to control 4 people and everybody else is acting with best intent, which I think parallels our modern whistleblowers being quite often fed disinformation. I in no way want to be scandalous about Lou Elizondo, but it's relatively obvious that the guy's been set up for a fall in recent events with his presentation of photographs and information which has proved to be false. That is insulting to the guy's intelligence to think that he would just do this, you know, winging it. You don't wing it in front of Congress. I think it speaks of a very detailed counterintelligence operation. So the main thing is, if we get down to the core of what is the motive for this, well, we've all heard the term catastrophic disclosure. Now, also, we know that we don't have control over the phenomena as much as people would love it. And the only real catastrophe comes from the lack of control of the government. If a giant craft turned up out of the blue over a capital city around the world in full view of the media, and we hadn't been softly prepared for this, we would have no frame of reference, and there would be no predictable course that would happen. However, by growing up, knowing with things like Lilo and Stitch and E.T. teaching you empathy for these particular creatures, it gives you at least some vague frame of reference of what you're looking at, what you're encountering, and that comes down to control. So, as faith in the news and mainstream media continues to crumble, I think it's exceptionally plausible that when we are defenseless and when we are suspending our disbelief and transported to these wonderful sci-fi and fantasy worlds, we are open and impressionable. We've all come out of a great movie emulating the character. I remember when I first saw Gladiator and I came out and I was sticking my chest out and trying to be super honourable. You know, we've all had that. And I think that if you were to weaponize that, you would have a very effective means of control. But what's the point? Well, I think it boils down to the fact that the governments and the intelligence communities of the world do not have control over the phenomena. It does not respond well to being hunted like prey and commodified. And so how do you prepare people for something totally unpredictable? Just like the Varginha case and E.T. If you bump into a little 4-foot brown smelly thing now, the first thing that's going to pop into your head during that fight or flight response is, oh my God, it's E.T. You know, there's more of a chance for empathy and control of the situation. If you imagine a giant craft turning up over a major capital city anywhere in the world without any form of cultural reference, you would have total chaos. And chaos is the enemy of control. And control is what governments and intelligence communities are all about. Now, I think I've made the point clear enough. I'd really like to know what particular movies and media influenced you. And just as a last little cherry on the top, you won't find anything about Anne Spielberg if you Google it or if you go on ChatGPT. In fact, I did to try and research this case. I never used ChatGPT, and I was encouraged to give it a go. And it said, oh no, I don't know anything about Anne Spielberg. I can tell you about his younger sister who makes Israeli propaganda films. Or we can talk about Steven Spielberg in great length and how wonderful he is. And I said, no, I'd like to know about Anne Spielberg and her involvement with the Air Force. Oh, I don't really know about that. It was only from a very trusted and trustworthy source that I learned the truth. Likewise, wouldn't it be weird if the Air Force paid for and helped script Stargate SG-1, which is a series all about portals in the desert? Now, I can tell you this as fact because I've seen it. There is a video in existence with Ron Pandolfi, who, if you aren't aware, is widely suspected to be one of the CIA's gatekeepers when it comes to dissemination of information. This video is in a hotel bar with him and his wife speaking to two friends. I remember it absolutely perfectly because it's jaw-dropping. In it, he is talking to a friend and he says, next time, I think it's Paul, you come out to the desert, I will show you the portal to another world. Okay? You search for that now and it flags up with a Google warning that the content that you are searching for may have been removed due to certain laws about privacy and having yourself scrubbed from the internet. So the question is, why? I'll leave you to think on that and I'll see you soon. Thanks for watching. The irreducible part about human consciousness kind of being reflective of the universe itself. I know that sounds very, very philosophical.